All right, guys, if you're there, come back. All you video people that I can't see. Oh, those are mostly people in class.
Yeah, that's us.
Well, yes, that way people online can see you. It'd be nice if you all turned on your videos. Okay, so let's finish talking about, hang on, where did my PowerPoint go? There it is. Let's finish talking about our determining the quality of the evidence. Oh wait, before we do this, Gina, what were you gonna say? We can't hear you.
She's freaking out.
There we go. Okay, I was just going to say, what was I going to say? So, in my case, I am planning on
We can't hear you. No, you no, you cut out. We got like the first 3 or 4 words and then.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I need to keep my hands down so they don't hover. Because I talk with my hands a lot. I'll sit on them. So my intention is to use 2 different facilities. One that uses essential oils and one that does not. So that would be my control group.
Yeah.
So that way nobody's losing out on anything because they're already not using something they don't have to begin with.
Yeah, as long as there are other elements of the 2 facilities that are the same.
Right, right. So, and I'm using my last intern to assist with the research. So that should be very helpful.
So as this is a good example, as you're reviewing quality of studies, you would want to, if somebody set up a situation where they're using multiple sites, one is a control group, one is an intervention group, you've got to read all about how they establish those criteria for who's who and how similar are they to determine whether or not that was a good move or a bad move. They've got to write about it. So I'm trying to tie it back to our topic, but thank you for sharing that. So let's try to get through the rest of these slides really quick so that we can kind of talk about some other things. So there are lots of elements here that we can use to determine the quality of these individual studies. In terms of the implementation of their studies, how many subjects were they recruited? Did they try to blind and then things went wrong? How many people dropped out of their study? How much missing data do they have? Any fluctuations in their sampling? Deviations from the protocol? So, you know, if you say that this is how you're going to do your study, and then as you're producing results, none of that ties back to the process that you outlined, man, how would that get published? Who knows? Lots of things get published that shouldn't be published. But if you're reading through articles and you're catching stuff like that, all of that are indicators of poor quality research. You don't want to include that in your review because it's not rigorous enough to produce findings that are credible, that you can like stand on when you say this is what the evidence tells us we should do with regards to this population and this intervention. So when you're determining the quality of evidence of an entire body of studies, so let's say now you've gathered all of the evidence you can possibly gather on a certain topic, like on family leisure, look at the number of studies. Is it 1? Is it 20? Is it 100? You know, and you would have looked at each of those individually, but as a whole, is this enough? Can you say? And a lot of you guys commented about the COIL article where they only reviewed 4 studies. And some of you were like, well, I was surprised it was only 4 studies. But then others were like, well, it was only 4 studies. So what do you guys think about those 4 studies that they talked about? You read the articles. Is 4 enough? Or thoughts? Maybe we'll come back to that. Hold on to that one. So then the quality of those individual studies we just talked about.
4 is not enough.
I don't think 4 is enough either, but So then we would have to go to their recommendations, their implications, and what are they saying? Are they saying change all programming for this population based on these 4 studies? Is that what they said? Good, because they shouldn't have said that based on 4 studies. But you can still gather knowledge from 4 well-done studies. So we just have to be careful with how the recommendations that come out the other end when you're only have a few. The size of the studies, is it if they reviewed 4 large randomized controlled trials, I would say that that's pretty awesome. And I would say you could probably stand on that and say recommendations for all programming with this based on these 4 studies, if they were high level randomized controlled trials. But if it was just 4 studies, single subject design or case study where it's only like 1 or 2 participants in each of those 4 studies, no. So we have to really dig into, when you look at a systematic review, you have to really dig into what they reviewed too to determine whether the systematic review is a good review of these 4 studies. Consistency of the findings. So were those 4 studies, were the findings all over the place, or were they 4 fairly similar outcomes with regards to the population and the intervention? Hopefully they were fairly consistent with each other, because if they're wildly all over the place, you can't then make recommendations based off of it for programming or working with that population. You could say, make recommendations for research, like, do better research so that the findings are more consistent, or you'd have to really dig into why they were inconsistent. Did they use way different scales of depression, measures of depression? Well, if so, then they're producing different numbers and they might not be able to be interpreted the same, which then means they probably shouldn't have been included in that review. Okay, so when we produce systematic reviews and then when we read a systematic review, we have to be critical about everything that's included in that on both, from both levels, both sides of that. So effect sizes, these really, again, this is like the magnitude of the impact of something or the magnitude of change in something, and not all articles report that, individual articles. The Hodge article that we read generated an effect size, but none of the individual articles that she reviewed had effect sizes on their own. So it's hard to say that this type of an intervention has this kind of an impact if no articles have ever produced or offered effect sizes. So, and that's one of her, I believe in her discussion section, she says, APA requires that you produce or you report effect sizes, but none of these articles did, which is why we don't have a quantitative understanding of what the impact is. So if you're reviewing literature that doesn't produce any effect sizes, but you're trying to understand the impact of something, that makes it really hard to say that this is good quality literature, because they don't report that stuff. If the things that are included in a systematic review, the articles that are included are not really applicable to the research question, it's inappropriate for them to be in the review, and it's not a good review. So hopefully they are the same population or the same intervention or the same outcomes. All of that is kind of discussed in there. Now, it wasn't the same population in like our family studies that we had these examples of, but it was the same in the sense that it was family, right? All of the same measures were used to measure family leisure involvement for the most part across everything. So it's relevant even though we had different populations in terms of different types of families. But it all has to be tied back to that initial question. Okay, and if the articles that are being included don't tie back to that question, then it's not appropriate to be in there. It's not a good review. Okay, so most of what exists out there in terms of reviews of body of literature is unsystematic. And this is how it's really been for kind of ever and ever until systematic reviews came along in like what, the 70s and 80s, the 1970s and 80s. We have to be clear about that because we might be alive to say 2070 and 2080. Weird. Okay, so in the past, authors picked the studies in a review randomly. They weighted those studies randomly without any process. And they drew conclusions that probably were biased based on their own personal interests and histories, et cetera, because they didn't have a pre-established and a priori process to follow. And peer review also of your process also helps to remove that bias. Okay, so if you say that I'm going to analyze it like this, review it, collect all this data, review it, and analyze it like this, and it somehow has a slant to it, somebody external to your process could say, hey, this is slanted a little bit. It's a little bit biased. Consider this. Okay, but that's not how things were usually done. So systematic reviewing kind of came about in the 80s, and they kind of came up with these levels of evidence. So this is one of the articles we read last week, I think, or the week before, had levels. Oh, the book chapter. Those levels are slightly different than these levels, but for the most part, they kind of follow the same general trend. So level 1 evidence is really the pinnacle of what we want. These are randomized controlled trials or clinical trials, RCTs, with low false positives and low false negatives. So basically, this is a high power study. High power means you have good chances of finding change. So if we're talking about change in functioning levels, pre, post, and follow-up multiple time points, something with high power means you're going to find change, and that's good. RCTs with low power are still better than a lot of other things, even though you have low power and you might not find change because you don't have a big enough sample size or some other elements there. But randomized controlled trials have so many characteristics that make them more rigorous than some of our other research designs that even one with low error or low power is better than others, than the non-randomized controlled trials. Anybody know any RCTs in rec therapy? Off the top of your head? I know one person who's doing it, Marika.
Mm-hmm.
I know our very own Dr. Van Pembroek. She sets up randomized controlled trials with her yoga studies. And she has control groups. She doesn't blind who goes into what groups, but she does delayed treatment control groups. So people act as their own, or her participants act as their own control group. So they get nothing and then they get the treatment later on while some people are getting the treatment the whole time. It's really, really interesting how she does it. It's super duper duper complicated, and she's got all these stats people who do all the numbers for her because it's so complicated. I don't know of any other rec therapy randomized controlled trials. They cost a lot of money and they take a lot of time and resources. So to some degree, I mean, I could run all the numbers on all of my own projects because I can do my own stats. Like I wanted to learn that skill in grad school, so I learned that. So I can pretty much do all my own stuff. But when it comes to more complicated things like RCTs, I can't run any of those numbers. I would need a statistician to do it for me, which means I then need to pay somebody to do all that, which means I have to have some money to do this research. So if you're trying to do something like this in practice, where are you going to get the resources, the money to pay for that type of stuff? That's something you have to consider when you're doing randomized controlled trials. This is why they don't exist very much in rec therapy, because it's really hard to do them in practice, especially with patients in practice, right? Because that means some of your patients are not getting the treatment. They might get it eventually if you do like a delayed, whoever said that over there, a delayed treatment control group. But some people aren't in treatment long enough to get the treatment later on. So how do you work with the timing? So it's really hard to do randomized controlled trials in a non-controlled setting. And by that, I mean labs. This is where most randomized controlled trials happen, are in labs, because you can control all of those elements. It's really hard in practice. Level 3, non-randomized concurrent cohort comparisons between contemporaneous patients who did and did not receive treatments. Okay, so a lot of words that, let's not get bogged down in that. But basically the first element there, these are non-randomized groups. Level 4, similar non-randomized historical cohort comparisons between current patients who did receive a treatment and former patients from the same institution who did not. So that's an example of a level 4. And then level 5, case series without controls. So if we were to look at it in like a visual hierarchy here, RCTs at the top, case reports down at the bottom. These have the least rigor. These have the most rigor. These are the most resource and time intensive. These are least resource time intensive. The reality in practice is that probably these bottom 3 are the most realistic to what we could do in practice. And the top ones, not so much. So that is just to give some insight into why it will be difficult to find those top tier research or top tier publications or research designs in specific direct therapy. So we have to look outside our field when we start reviewing literature. But it makes it hard when you're trying to review our literature, produce a systematic review of our own literature, and we don't have much. Bummer. Another way to kind of critique the evidence, an A, B, or C method. So it gets an A if it's supported by at least 1, preferably more, level 1 RCT, a B if it's supported by at least 1 level 2 RCT, and then a C if it's reported by only level 3, 4, or 5 type of a study. I would say most rec therapy literature is probably a C type of a thing. Again, the constraints of doing this in practice mean that it's really difficult to do RCTs to get an A or a B rating on some of our studies. What about mixed methods? Do we know what that is? It is qualitative and quantitative methods all in the same study. Where's the usefulness in that?
So we were talking about the comparison between the 2 articles earlier of yours being qualitative and the other one being quantitative. So you kind of get that traditional kind of hardcore number evidence that supposedly is great. But then you get the relatability and the readability and like the more close, I don't know.
If those 2 articles had come out of the same study and been all one article, that would have been a mixed method study, right? So we're producing we're using quantitative methods to produce this knowledge or recommendations in addition to qualitative methods, and they address different questions within the same question. So that's really what mixed methods, it is the best of both worlds. That's how I like to look at it. There is a whole group of people who think that mixed methods isn't that good, that you can't do both in one study, that it's either one or the other. You can never do justice to the methods for each approach in one study because you're split between so much and it takes so much work. It does take a lot of work to do mixed methods. Then you have a whole group of people who say it's only quantitative that matters, and then a whole group of people that says it's only qualitative that matters. So I don't really know. It's just reading your comment there, Jake. Token Mill and Jake. Yeah, it is the best of both worlds. I don't know, thoughts, people online. I'm trying to make sure there's opportunities for you guys to contribute, because I know this sometimes is a talkative group in class.
I like the idea of a mixed method study.
Say that again?
I said I like the idea of a mixed method study. So you might miss something if you just did qualitative or vice versa. Like this way you're kind of covering all the bases in a way. It's more work, but I mean, if you can do it, then it makes sense.
It is, and I would say that a quantitative only study gives you one perspective on a phenomenon, right? So let's say you want to look at change in functioning over time, and all you do is collect this quantitative measure of it, and it shows no change. But then as a practitioner, because I wear both a practitioner and a researcher's hat, so I see quantitatively from this research perspective, no change in my numbers. But when I put on my practitioner hat, I see my clients are telling me that things are different.
Mm-hmm.
They're taking less medication, they're sleeping better, they're this, they're that. But my numbers don't reflect any of that. What's going on, right? So I could do interviews or whatever. What changes have you seen in your life since participating in this intervention or whatever? Oh, I'm sleeping better, and I'm this, and I noticed this, and I noticed this. And you get a lot of really rich information from that gives context to those numbers, maybe, or helps explain the quantitative findings. And I would say that in addition to like their level of rigor that comes out of a randomized controlled trial, could really give you a lot of insight, like depth, right, to these numbers that may or may not look good or bad, whatever. But if you don't ask those questions, that side of it, the qualitative side of it, then you just don't get any of that insight. And an intervention could look totally useless based on the numbers from a purely statistical standpoint.
And then again, a qualitative research may lead you to change your quantitative research a little bit differently, so that maybe those numbers and that data is going to change. So it may take you either another direction or change maybe a little bit differently how you obtain that data to begin with. So it may take you a totally different direction.
It can only take you a different direction for future studies. So
Right.
Somebody asked this question, once you start a study, as you get your results, can you change your instruments? Can you change your hypotheses? Nope. You finish it out. Even if you see it going down, it's crashing and burning, you finish it out. Now, it may change how you do your next study. It may change what instruments you use next time, and it may change what, you may tweak that intervention a little bit, type of a thing. But once you start, you have to finish it all the way through.
Why do you have to finish it? If it looks like it's or if it's tanking?
They go against your IRB if you don't.
Oh, well, okay.
Because this is research ethics. We don't just change in the middle of a study.
Well, not change, but
Okay, if we're talking about like patients getting injured, obviously we would stop our, our study. But if your hypothesis is that there will be an increase in functioning and, over the course of an 8-week program and with a 2-month follow-up after that, if you see at, 8 weeks, they've finished your intervention and you done pre and post and there's no change in their functioning, you can't be like, well, I'm just not going to collect the follow-up data. There wasn't any change here. You have to finish it all the way through, regardless of what your hypothesis was.
okay.
So, where are we going with this?
I made that point in class.
You what?
I made that point on our discussion board.
Okay. In relation to what, though? I know this is why I brought it up, because people made a couple of comments about it, but I can't remember what the context was.
Oh, she was saying that the qualitative stuff would affect
Oh, that's right.
the quantitative.
Yeah,
And
when
then
you
you
do
would
mixed
change
methods,
that.
it could change
You
your
don't-
direction. That's right. Sorry, bringing it
You
back
just
to
report the
Gina's.
facts.
Yeah, so it can't change your direction in the current study that you're doing, but it could change your direction in future studies. That's right.
That
Thank
was
you.
my point.
Oh
That-
my gosh.
In future studies, it could change your direction.
And
That
that's
was
not
my point.
But that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's called refinement, right?
Right.
So mixed method studies, I do feel like have a place in research, even though they may not be visually represented in something like this, in this hierarchy. They may not have a way to be graded. And maybe that's because there aren't a ton of mixed method studies out there in our field or other fields. I mean, it's growing. It's its own kind of field. So Yeah, most people think that randomized controlled trials are used to make policy and practice, and to some degree in the medical field, they are the gold standard and nothing else will be considered. But you can gain a lot of useful information from this other stuff. So bringing it back to this is that don't only look for randomized controlled trials when we're doing systematic reviews, because in our field specifically, there aren't enough to say that, use those as our evidence. So we have to open up our search criteria to include lower level things. But lower levels doesn't necessarily mean bad. You can still set rigorous criteria for inclusion and exclusion with these lower level, lower tier studies. Some other definitions of levels of evidence, and I don't really want to belabor this because a number of different people have kind of come up with a levels type of a thing, but this is a little bit more broad. Well-designed prospective RCTs with true randomization or quasi-randomized assignment. So this is just a 3-level criteria. So prospective non-randomized cohort studies. So quasi-randomized, that didn't really show up in that other 5-level thing. It was either randomized or not. So now you have this I could do some randomization, but not total randomization. Maybe I couldn't randomize into my treatment group, but I could into my control group. Who knows? Lots of different scenarios for that. So non-randomized down here in level 2, and then level 3, clinical series without concurrent controls. So you do some type of pre-post testing, but you don't have a control group to compare to. So a lot of rec therapy stuff falls in level 3 here based on this 3-level definition. And then this is kind of that same 3-level thing. Practice standards can be made based on at least one well-designed class 1 or level 1 study with an adequate sample or overwhelming class 2 evidence. So here this is saying that there's good evidence to support a recommendation as to whether this treatment could be used with this population. Practice guidelines. So we talked about clinical guidelines and things like that the other day, and the evidence that contributes to that. So you need enough evidence to then say these are the guidelines based on the evidence to work with this population. Well, this is one way that this author guy Cicerone is saying that you could compile evidence to make practice guidelines or standards of practice with regard to a population. Practice guidelines are based on well-designed class 2 studies with adequate samples, and it provides fair evidence, and then practice options. So this is loosely, here's one option of practice based on class 2 or class 3 studies. But here, this is with unclear clinical certainty. The evidence presents these options for practice with this population, but it's not strong enough to say that there's any certainty that the outcomes will be this. And so that's where they have these distinctions between what kind of recommendations you can make based off the evidence. You can establish standards, which is the highest level, this is how you practice with these people. Guidelines, which is a little bit less, strict, and then options, which is you could do this, but might not see anything type of thing. Thoughts on this? Kate, what's your question?
What is meant by fair evidence? I don't think I understand that term. That means that it's okay, it's not great. It's just,
So if you think about this in terms of what they're trying to do here is say that if you are going to make your recommendations are going to be practice standards, we're trying to establish standards of practice with this population. What that's saying is that the body of knowledge that you're basing it on is good evidence of the outcomes, or, how does it say it here? Provides good evidence to support a recommendation as to whether the treatment be specifically considered for persons with, for this particular example, acquired neurocognitive impairments and a disability. That means that the evidence that they gathered, they identified as level 1 or class 1 research is high quality to such a degree that they feel like this is good enough evidence to say this is how you practice with this population. Fair evidence would be, it's good, but not, maybe the studies there, because they're class 2 studies, are not quite as rigorous as the other category. And so it's good, but there's still some questions there as to whether or not this really is the best practices. And then the, unclear clinical certainty, they're class 3 studies, class 2 or class 3. They're weaker studies, and so we can't say with any certainty that this is the best approach to work with this population. So there is some ambiguity in terms of what is good, fair, and unclear evidence, only in this definition, but the ambiguity shouldn't really be there because they have a criteria that says what class 1 is, class 2, and class 3. So it shouldn't be too difficult to classify those studies.
But so we have to kind of do that on our own, knowing what goes into the different levels. After we read it, we decide
this is class 1, this is class 2, or this is class 3.
It'd be nice if they kind of had that as a header.
Well, so if you have, let's say you find 20 studies about substance use, right? Because that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
If you find 20 studies about substance use and self-esteem, and you go through and classify all of them as class 1, 2, or 3, or level 1, 2, and 3, and 15 of them are level 1s, and a couple are level 2s, and a couple are level 3s, I would say that you have good evidence to say this is how we practice with people with substance use disorder.
So you could actually make this a part of your criteria too, is to say, I only looked at, especially if you get a wealth of stuff, I only looked at
Yes.
level 1 and level 2s. Okay.
Yes. Or not that you only looked at it, but that you only included, because you
Included it, right. I ruled it out if it was below a level 3.
Exactly. So good segue here. How do you really rate? So there's lots of different rating scales. There's one called the Jadad scale. I don't even know if I just pronounced that right. But again, this is a different method. There's those levels, but this one gives you a score. So it just has these 5 items, and it gets either a 0 or a 1. So no or yes. Is this study described as randomized? Yes or no. Is this method of generating the randomization sequence appropriate? Yes or no. You should be able to evaluate that, right? If you can't evaluate that, you get somebody who can, and they tell you this is appropriate or not. Is double blinding used? Yes or no. Is the method of double blinding appropriate? Yes or no. Is there a description of withdrawals and dropouts? Yes or no. So it's a 1 or a 0, a total score of 0 to 5, with a higher score indicating a stronger randomized controlled trial. The Jadad, I don't know how to say it, scale is only used to evaluate the quality of RCTs. Okay, so if you are reviewing a lot of those as part of your review area, your topic area, say there's a ton available to you, awesome. This would be a good way to measure quality versus not quality. If you've got a lot of 4s and 5s, those are probably pretty good RCTs. A 3, I don't know. You'd have to read up about this scale to determine what's an appropriate Jadad score or not. I mean, if you have a 1, that's probably not a very strong RCT, right? Maybe they called it randomized, but then the sequence for randomization was not appropriate. It wasn't double blinded. They didn't explain the double blinding, and there was no explanation of attrition. That's not a good RCT. Okay. There's another scale to use, the Pedro scale. It has 11 criteria, way more detail than the Jadad scale, and this is also on a 0 to 1 score. So all of this, blinding of subjects, blinding of therapists, similar groups at baseline, allocation was concealed, so yeah, randomly allocated, more blinding there. Eligibility criteria were specified. Sorry, these get a little small. Blinding of all assessors who are measuring. Measures of at least one key outcome were obtained from more than 85% of the subjects. So they're getting really strict in their criteria to be a quality RCT. 85%. response rate, basically. That's really high. But you don't want to be making recommendations on a study that initially had 1,000 people and then, 900 dropped out, right? So they want people to go all the way through all the time points through the entire study. Well, that's fantastic. That doesn't happen often in rec therapy research. I can tell you based on my experience with people dropping out all the time. They're not missing a lot of data. They're reporting findings for comparisons on multiple outcomes. Is basically what 10 and 11 are. So a 0 to 1 score, total of 0 to 10, which I'm not sure how because there's 11 items here, but I read these, I went back through this a billion times and was like, how do you get a score of 10 if they put a 1 on all 11 items? I don't know. Higher scores indicate stronger RCTs. So again, if you establish a criteria that you don't want anything less than a 6, then that helps weed out the good stuff and keep the bad stuff. If you guys want to find out more about it, you can go to this website. Other ways to judge quality of randomized controlled trials, so checklists or those rating scales already, so that we looked at identifying weaknesses. Here's the rating scale. You can weight studies, and there's a lot of different ways that you can weight, and I don't want to get into it here. You can determine if there's an impact from that particular study on practice or any other conclusions. So if it's a nothing study, like nobody's read it, there's no impact of it, does that matter to you? You have to be able to justify all of this. So you can kind of give things scores and then combine items together to create overall scores based on how well they performed in comparison to the other studies. And I'm going to show you guys 2 examples of some reviewing quality reviews forms. So yay for systematic reviews. How do we feel about it right now? Did I just explode everybody's brains?
I think I understand it more.
You guys read 3.
Well, I have one question. With systematic reviews, can you include other reviews in your
Can you include other systematic reviews in your systematic review? I don't think so.
No?
No, you could use it in the lit review portion of it and say, as you're building your case for why you need to do a review of this, and if there's one that already exists, but you wouldn't want to replicate that one that already exists, but you could use it as evidence for then changing some way. So in the Hodges article, there was a systematic review that reviewed all the family leisure literature from like 1930 to 1990. But it was not a meta-analysis systematic review. It was more like what I did, a qualitative strengths, weaknesses. This is what we need to do with this field now. And so her review took all the family leisure literature from 1991, when that one was finished, up to 2016, I believe. So she reviewed everything since then, and she did it with a quantitative approach to it. So, but she used that one as evidence of building a case for why she needed to do her study. So yes, you can use it, but not as one of your...
But part of the lit review process and would not be included in systematic review.
It would not be part of your data.
It should be something that like guided you towards that direction.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And you would not want to do the exact same review that they did, because you'd pull all the same literature. So you'd have to have some criteria on your search would have to be different than theirs, so that you pulled different literature. Because why would you do the same literature that they did? Theoretically, you should have the same recommendations, right? Okay. Save my recording. Sorry, guys. We blamed the Zoom account. I was texting with the other RT faculty during break. I was like, who logged in and kicked me out of my class? We blamed it on Brent. And so I said, guilty. And Dr. Lewis said, case dismissed. That's what that is. Sorry about that. Okay, so I want to show you some examples. This is a critical review form for qualitative studies. Man, this class goes by so fast. We're having such awesome discussion. You guys are like, yeah, I'm just tired. It's okay. So you would use this form for every single qualitative article that you came across if you were going to do a qualitative review, like a meta-synthesis, like what I did. I did not use this form, but you could use something like this. So you put the actual citation in here and then go through and just answer these questions as it pertains to each individual article. Was the purpose and research question stated clearly? Yes, no. And then maybe describe it right here. Literature, was the lit review done, good or bad? I like this. It gives you kind of some little questions. How does this apply to your practice or your research question? Is it worth continuing the review? Yes, no. So don't ever include something in your review as one of your pieces that you found that you're not really going to review. Like, I got through the abstract and thought it was garbage, so I tossed it. Well, that doesn't really count as one of the things that you reviewed, okay? So if you pull 40 articles, you read the abstract and 20 of them, you're like, not good. You only reviewed 20, not 40. But this is giving you an option to enter information about the ones that you didn't use. When I do my own reviews, I don't enter information about things that I don't actually use. It just kind of muddies my stuff. What was the design? Here's some details. So basically you're kind of weighing in like your opinion on what you think the quality was. Does it have a theoretical perspective identified? Theory. Remember we talked about that last week? We do not do research without theory. What are the methods? How they get their sample? Informed consent. Interesting that they put that on there because most research has to have it. I mean, all research basically has to have it, but that's interesting that you would have a criteria for that. Data collection, how is it collected? All of this, you can critique all of this. So I like this because it gives you something to follow. Like, I'm not really sure how to critique an article for being good or bad. And this tells you, if you're saying no to most of this stuff, it's not a good article. Don't include that in your review. I don't want to read about it in your evidence table or your annotated bibliography. So I don't want like a citation that says, this thing was a piece of crap and I'm not going to use this at all for my study. Don't include that in your 10 articles that you submit for class, okay? We also have a quantitative, and I'll post these on, I almost said Facebook, Canvas. I'll post it on Canvas after class today. So if you guys want to use these, and you don't have to necessarily do these with your assignment in this class, but if you want to do one, you can, just so you see what it's like. Doc students, these might be handy for you in your future as you become more of a scholar. Same thing with the quantitative. Put in your form, your citation, good lit review, what kind of design was it? It may not be any of these, in which case you'll have to explain potentially. What's the sample size? Do they describe it? Is it justified, et cetera, all more details. What are the outcomes? Do they use reliable measures? List them out here. Whoa, sorry. Provide a short description of the intervention if it's an intervention study. It should be if you're reviewing interventions, literature on a certain intervention, there should be an intervention. What were the results? Are they explained well? Is it appropriate? Do they have any dropouts? Okay, what do you guys think? Handy dandy little forms here.
It's a really good way just to organize the ocean. As you're
Organize the ocean, I like it. As you're sailing through so that you're not. Did you just say Irma Gerd?
Actually, I've been saying that all week.
It's like funny that you said that. I've hashtagged everything I've said. Yeah, I do. I literally just got it. Yeah, that was the first time I looked up and there's one that said, where's my favorite verbals for bubbles?
Oh my gosh. It just makes it. I haven't heard it.
Okay, so I'm pulling up here the evidence table, which is kind of your next, your next assignment. And this is something you're working on for a few weeks, right? So this is developed the next level from the TIS form. So this is assuming that through your searching, your initial searching, you have found at least 10 articles to review, to include in your annotated bibliography for the master's students, PhD students, your lit review, or your paper, or we'll talk more about what you want to call it. But this is where you can really fill this in. It's just, I would say that this isn't really a review form in terms of establishing the quality, but this is one way to organize the ocean, okay, to do a quick extraction of information into a much more consumable format rather than reading every article every time you need, oh, I remember this one article had this really great something in it and I can't remember what. And then you have to dig through all your articles again, right? Or some people write notes all over their articles, like they print them out and do that, and that's totally fine. I used to do that. Or in PDF, and you know, little comment bubbles and all types of stuff. But still, it's hard when you've got, once you get into dissertation land and you're talking about 150 articles or something like that. This can really help organize all of that and put it in a way that you can use it quickly. So when I did the systematic review, the article you guys read, I'm going to show you. I brought it here with me. This is the notebook that produced that article. Big, fat, huge notebook. This is every article that was ever published that made it into that review. And I used to have I actually printed out the evidence table because I had it in the grad office laid out all over the floor, and I was like highlighting and drawing lines and all over it and like notes all over it type of a thing. But they really do come in handy. And whether you ever print it out or not, you know, it's kind of up to you. But when you're reviewing a lot of literature, it just is good to have all of that placed in a easily digestible format, and an evidence table does that. So everybody has to do one. You can see kind of what I'm asking for in each of these columns. I will say that in the conclusions and issues over here, when I was reading through articles, I was like, oh my gosh, this is a fantastic point or quote. And I would type it into my conclusions section, word for word, put quotes around it and the page number, if that was something that I knew I was probably going to cite when I was actually writing my paper. That way, when I got back to the writing stage, I'm like, oh, I know I wrote that down somewhere. Where? In my evidence table. And I could just go right to it. And so, again, really easy way to extract data and keep it in a usable place. It will take some time to fill this out. You have to read every article from front to back to be able to fill out your evidence table. But it is well worth the effort in doing that. Because once you do all of that, you will know your literature in your area forwards and backwards.
Is that due next week or in 2 weeks?
I feel like that's in 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
I was just going to comment on that quick. We had to do an evidence table in our, I think it was theoretical application with Dr. Fragid, I'm bad at names, Dr. F. Tammy Fragidakis, I think was her name.
Fraggle Rock.
And it was super helpful. We did it with all the theories. And then when we had to write papers and stuff and had to apply our theories, it was great.
Yep.
I think Jake and Shannon were in that class.
It's well worth it, guys. I just found my evidence table for that particular article, the not printed out version, the digital version, so I want to show it to you guys. So I changed my columns around just a little bit because as I was going through the evidence, I was like, man, I need more than just the author name and stuff like that. Can you guys see that document okay, or should I blow it up? So when it comes to like producing one that you use on your own for your own stuff, really do the columns need to include what you need for your project. For the purpose of this class, just do what's in the columns that I provide on that template, okay? But, you know, I shortened the author names. I put what year it was because there was a chronological issue that I needed to follow with this in terms of the progression of a cohort from start to now. And so I needed the years and the order. You may not necessarily need that on yours, but it also might be helpful to see a progression, a chronological issue. So if you want to record the years, you can do that. The focus here was like what the outcomes were, basically, that they were studying. What the analyses, what the analysis was that they did. Everything. Go ahead.
I have my complete evidence table if you want me to share my screen.
Sure. Let me finish on mine really quick.
You go ahead. You do your thing, girl.
So as I was going through, you know, I created the evidence table first, just, you know, information dump type of a thing. And then as I used it more and more, I started doing things like coding things with colors, and it all meant something to me. This is, my brain works in colors, apparently, because I really liked going through and highlighting the consistent things from article to article. So if they did pink or blue, I can't remember, so I'm having to look at it and be like, what does blue pertain to? Oh, yeah.
My articles for my thesis.
Yeah, so correlations. If they did correlations, I highlighted it that tealish color. So I could scroll through really quickly and see, oh man, everybody's doing correlations. Just about everybody did it, okay? That's how my brain works. If that's not how your brain works, don't do that. But you make this your own thing once you actually start doing these for your projects. I'm gonna stop sharing. Jake, you can share yours.
Let me figure this out real quick. All right, share screen.
I have a question. In the syllabus, it says at least 10, but you're saying 10. So are we doing 10 or are we doing more than 10 for the evidence-based table?
You were doing 10, but I don't want 20. If you found 11, you could do 11. If you found 12, you could do 12. But I don't want like 20 or 30 articles.
Okay,
either.
but like if we do 10, that's not going to affect our grade in the sense of if compared to someone who did 15 or something like that.
No,
Okay.
You need to have 10. Absolutely have 10. But if you found some awesome other things, you can include up to 15. So I have to read all that too. So please don't do 20 articles, everybody. The reality though, doc students, is that as you write a lit review, you're going to need way more than 10 articles, especially if this is like your dissertation topic. So this is just a start for the doc students. For master's students, I think for the purposes of this class, 10 is sufficient, but if you found a few more that you wanted to include, that's okay too. Okay, Jake, go ahead.
Can you guys see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this was my theories table for Dr. Fraggle Rock's class, and it went on and on with the author and the year, the theory, the purpose and key points of the theory, and was there any research that was provided, and it just said give a brief summary. If there was no research, just write not applicable. And like I said, it went on and on and on to the point where I ended up with 88 different theories.
So this is for the advanced theories class, right?
Yes. I'm doing the program backwards. I started in like Shannon and I think Holly did as well. We all started in the spring. So we're a step ahead of this class.
Yeah, so this class is meant to go first so that you learn how to do evidence tables and create a question. And then you go into Dr. Halo's class next semester, or whoever online teaches it, I don't know. But for you guys here, it's Dr. Halo's class, research methods, and you refine that question. And then at the same time, you're in the theories class, advanced theories class, learning about all the theories that you may use to help answer that question, type of a thing. So they've kind of gone, you guys have gone backwards, but I mean, you're still getting, yeah, you got the information. But you can use an evidence table for whatever. And it can, you make it how you want to, how your brain works, pulling the information that you think is most useful to you, type of a thing. But yeah, everybody should do one. Everybody will do one for this class, but everybody should do one also for your project, thesis, or dissertation. It just will help you, you know, for if you're going to become a scholar, if you want to do research, even in practice, you have to be well read. You have to know the literature around your population. You have to know the literature around your intervention. And if you are the type of person who, as you read things, it's in one ear, out the other ear, and you don't retain any of that, an evidence table is a good way to help retain some of that information. So you can make a billion evidence tables, or you can just make one big monster evidence table, like Jake's table.
Yeah,
So
the theories table really, it, even though I took it first before this class, it is really going to help me use those theories and apply them to my research project.
Mm-hmm.
So I already know them. I've already memorized most of those 88. So it's going to benefit me in the long run and make this, I don't want to say easier, but it will expedite the process.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. Any questions about systematic reviews? This is one, systematic reviews are one element of applied research. Okay. So somebody made a comment of, this seems like a really, in their discussion thread, a really big effort. How could I do this in practice? And what would be a more consumable way to do a systematic review than the 30-page articles that we read, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to do that in class. A KTP is like a super mini systematic review. Okay, so it might not be as comprehensive in terms of like every single thing there is to read. Your search parameters might be really, really specific, a little bit tighter than what we're going to do. Well, in this class, they'll be the same as what you're doing for your papers, right? But in practice, it might be a little bit tighter than what we would do in this class. But a KTP will produce some type of similar knowledge as what a big full systematic review would produce. So it is possible to do something like this in practice and not be overwhelmed by all those bajillions of steps in that PowerPoint slide. All right, any questions? Any last thoughts? Anything?
Can I go to bed now?
Yes.
Thank God.
All right. Good night. If there's nothing else, feel free to email me if you have any questions. Have a good night.
Good night, everyone.
Yeah.